So before I start this video, I should just say that this is actually a re-upload from my film channel, The Film Lounge. But I decided that I liked this video enough that I want to expose it to a wider audience here on the Linux Lounge. So if you liked this video, go ahead and check out my film channel, The Film Lounge. But with that said, here's my review of the 1927 classic Metropolis. So today we're going to be reviewing what is perhaps one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time, as well as perhaps the most ambitious silent film ever made, Metropolis. Metropolis is a silent German expressionist sci-fi film. It was directed by Fritz Lang and released in 1927, making it one of the last silent classics as it was released very close to the era when films with synchronized sound began to take over. However, despite Metropolis being one of the later silents, it was still one of the most ambitious films of its time. So much so that some people even consider it to be one of the first blockbuster films ever made, and it's easy to see why. It had a budget of 5.3 million Reichsmarks, which is equivalent to 38 million euros today, which is a budget that some modern blockbuster films don't even have. So to say that this film had a huge budget for its time is an absolute understatement. Despite how impressive Metropolis is though, the film actually received a very mixed reception at the time of its release. Critics found the film to be visually beautiful and powerful, which is a sentiment that I absolutely agree with, but they also found the story to be naive. Critics also accused the film of having an allegedly communist message. Even H.G. Wells described the film as silly. Another source of criticism of Metropolis was the film's long runtime of just over 2.5 hours. Unfortunately, the criticism resulted in this film's tragic fate. After Metropolis' premiere in Germany, the film was cut down significantly. The shortened versions of the film not only omitted a lot of important plot details, but they also caused the film to make a lot less sense generally as a result. Sadly, as a result of this, the original full-length cut of the film has actually been lost. However, thanks to restoration efforts, we now have a cut of the film which is only missing about 5 minutes of footage. But this version of the film was only released in 2010. Prior to that, audiences were sadly not able to watch this film in its entirety. Despite all this though, Metropolis would go on to be considered an absolute classic and one of the greatest and most influential films ever made. It even ranked 35th place in the Sight and Sound's 2012 Critics Poll. So with that said, let's talk about why exactly Metropolis is so great. Metropolis takes place in the far future in a city aptly enough named Metropolis. In Metropolis, the working class and upper class are separated. The upper class work in the city of Metropolis from giant modern and comfortable skyscrapers, whereas the working class work underground in dark cities that contain dangerous machinery. Underground, the working class must perform back-breaking labour for the sole benefit of the upper class. All of the city is ruled over by the city's master and the main character's father, Joe Friederson. The events of Metropolis are set in motion when Joe's son, Frieda, strays from the gardens where the sons of the upper class of Metropolis spend their time and witnesses an accident at one of the machines in Metropolis's underground. This awakens Frieda to the nature of the class divide in Metropolis. Now, it's fairly apparent that this film is about the injustices of class division and the exploitation of the working class. But despite what critics at the time of Metropolis' release said, I wouldn't go as far to say that this film is communist. Metropolis is probably too optimistic for that. Traditional communist theory dictates that the class struggle is a deliberate attempt of the upper class to oppress the working class. Metropolis, however, seems to take a more optimistic approach and instead suggests that the divide between the upper class and the lower class is more of a misunderstanding that can be resolved through a mediator who connects both classes. A lot of people would probably call this naive, and I would probably agree to some extent, but I also believe that there is a place in anti-capitalist art for a less bleak outlook on the class struggle. Another fascinating part of Metropolis' plot is its use of religious symbolism. Now, I'm sure a lot of the symbolism is lost on me, but I still do find it to be very fascinating, particularly the retelling of the Tower of Babel story as a philosophical misunderstanding rather than a linguistic one. I'd also just like to point out how much Metropolis actually got right about the future too. I find it especially impressive considering its age. The fact that Metropolis predicted video calling back in 1927, years before Space Odyssey did, is just absolutely mind-blowing to me. Metropolis really does have a fascinating and in-depth plot with really deep world building that I'm yet to see surpassed by another silent. What's more impressive is that there's absolutely no filler in this movie. Everything feels very intentional and every second counts, which makes it all the more depressing that this film was so heavily cut. Additionally, I found the plot of this film surprisingly easy to follow, whereas sometimes with some other silent films I've found myself struggling to follow what exactly is going on. I really do just have to emphasise how engaging and effective Metropolis is. I imagine that it's every bit as engaging and powerful now as it was back in 1927. Speaking of 1927, let's talk about something that critics applauded back in 1927, Metropolis's visuals. Back when it was released, critics applauded Metropolis's visuals, and frankly they're still absolutely stunning today. Everything from the grand shots of Metropolis to the early use of special effects is really visually stunning. Even the most mundane of shots are still visually stunning in Metropolis. What gives Metropolis a particularly visually stunning look is its fusion of Art Deco with a very industrial and sometimes even bleak look. The juxtaposition between the modern Art Deco city of Metropolis and the bleak underground city and machines is truly something stunning. Frankly, this film is just all round visually stunning. There isn't a single wasted shot in this film, which makes it particularly sad that much of this film is still only available through degraded film that lacks much of its original visual fidelity. But even despite that, this film is still an absolute visual masterpiece. With Metropolis being a silent film, it obviously goes without saying that the visuals are pretty important, but they're not the only aspect of a film. The name silent film is something of an inaccurate description. Silent films usually come with an accompanying soundtrack that makes watching them something of a musical experience, and Metropolis is definitely an exceptional musical experience. The accompanying soundtrack matches what's happening on screen extremely well. The pieces I found to be particularly notable are the ones that play when we see the city of Metropolis. I think there are exceptional tracks that really communicate the scale of Metropolis. I will also just quickly add, a lot of people are nervous about watching a silent film because they see them as something that's old and boring. A lot of the time people only think that because silent films don't have any synchronized audio, but I assure you that Metropolis is every bit as engaging as a modern film, and frankly while you're watching it you almost forget that it's a silent. So I guess we've reached the end of our review. That is Metropolis. I well and truly believe that all these years later, Metropolis hasn't aged a day. Its message is just as powerful and relevant as it was back in 1927. The visuals are also every bit as stunning as they ever were. The absolute worst criticism that I can make of this film is that its message is perhaps a little bit naive. But come on, I can't hate on a film for being optimistic. So, really there's no doubt in my mind that Metropolis is one of the best films ever made, and it really is a tragedy that a large portion of this film was missing for so long. But, with that said, if you haven't seen this film yet, you absolutely have to go out there and watch it. It's a true classic that everyone needs to see. But with that said, that's it for today's review. What do you think of Metropolis? Let me know in the comment section below. I thank you for watching and I will see you in the next one.